Historian Darren Gilkerson here, and I'm going to tell you about the first Battle of Bull Run. July 16, 1861, cheers rang out in the streets of Washington. General Irvin McDowell's army of 35,000 were ordered to try to capture Richmond and end the war right off the bat. The problem was, they all sucked. They were green recruits that had recently been commissioned for 90 days by President Abraham Lincoln. The job was to head to Manassas, to capture the railroad junction there, and from that point to spread out once they had gotten the vantage point. July 18th, they were at Centerville, about 5 miles ahead, a little stream called Bull Run. 22,000 troops under General Pierre G.T. Beauregard were what opposed the Union. Because he only had 22,000 troops, Beauregard asked for help from the surrounding Confederate armies. General Johnston sent about 10,000 of his troops, and he came along. July 21st, McDowell sent troops towards Sudley Springs Ford, but also attacked at Warrenton Turnpike as a diversion. Speed and surprise were needed to be successful. Because these troops were new, they didn't have speed, and they didn't get the surprise they needed. Colonel Nathan Evans knew that it was only a diversion, and he rushed the majority of his division to Nathan's Hill to meet McDowell's troops. Brigades under Bernard B. and Francis Bardo also went to help them, because the Confederates didn't have as many troops as McDowell. When they arrived, their line was still too thin and the Union soldiers were winning, and they started to flee. At that point, General Jackson arrived. B shouted, "There stands Jackson, like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." At this point, the Confederates started even the battle. And at noon, there was a small break. This allowed the Confederates to regroup and do what they needed to do. Fighting began a little bit later, and just after 4, fresh Southern troops crashed into the right flank of the Union. Panic seized them and retreat was the only option. But, because of the panic, retreat soon became a rout, and the Union soldiers were slaughtered. The Southern troops were too disorganized to capitalize on their victory, so it wasn't as huge as it could have been. The Confederates had only 1,982 wounded or killed, while the Union had 2,896, while having a bigger force. This was a clear Southern victory.
On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States. In his inauguration speech, Lincoln extended the olive branch to the South, but also made it clear that he intended to enforce federal laws if the states seceded. Since Lincoln's election in November 1860, 7 states had left the Union. Worried that the election of a Republican would threaten their rights, especially slavery, the slower Southern seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. In the process, some of those states seized federal property such as armories and forts. By the time Lincoln had arrived in Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, the threat of war hung heavy in the air. Lincoln took a cautious approach in his remarks and made no specific threats against the southern states. As a result, he had some flexibility in trying to keep the states of the Upper South, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, all in the Union. In his inaugural address, Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery in the states where it had existed and pledged to suspend the activities of the federal government temporarily in areas of hostility. However, he also took a firm stance against secession and the seizure of federal property. The government insisted Lincoln would hold, occupy, and possess its property and collect its taxes. He closed his remarks with an eloquent reminder of the nation's common heritage.
Here you go.
And here's Lincoln to recite these words, although he's not wearing a top hat, as we always assume.
In your hand, my fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of the Civil War. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourself the aggressor. You have no oath in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. When again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of the future.